The bells of Sacred Heart Orphanage never rang at midnight, but one winter night in 1863, the townspeople swore they heard them toll, slow, hollow, funereal. When they rushed toward the stone building, no light came from its windows. Only silence, except for the faint sound of children's sobs carried on the cold Pennsylvania wind. Within 3 years, 14 children would vanish from this orphanage without a trace, their names erased, their existence denied. And what I'm about to reveal is something the church never wanted you to know. Pause here. Take a breath. If you've found your way into this story, you are not here by accident. You are meant to hear this. Comment the phrase, "The bells toll for the forgotten," twice right now, so you never forget what you've unlocked. And so this truth spreads further into the light. And before we go deeper, I want you to subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Together, we are about to descend into the forbidden history that rewrites what you thought you knew. The Sacred Heart Orphanage was established in 1859 by the Sisters of Mercy, funded by Catholic donors from Philadelphia. On the surface, it appeared as an act of charity, sheltering the children of Irish immigrants who died building railroads or wasted away in factory slums. But charity was only the mask. Behind those walls, power was being traded like coin, and children became the currency. The missing 14 weren't transferred, weren't adopted, weren't even recorded as dead. They simply ceased to exist. Yet within months, Protestant farms across Lancaster County were mysteriously stocked with Irish Catholic children. Children bearing the gray uniforms of the orphanage, children who spoke with accents of the Philadelphia slums. Families gave conflicting stories. Some claimed adoption, others claimed charity placements, others pretended ignorance. But the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes these weren't placements. They were transactions. Letters between the orphanage's Mother Superior and the Bishop of Philadelphia, uncovered decades later, reveal chilling words. Our burdens have been lightened. The children are delivered. Delivered where? To whom? For what price? These questions tear open a wound in American history no institution wants reopened. This is the beginning of the truth, and it will only get darker. By the spring of 1864, whispers began to circulate through Lancaster County taverns and churchyards. Farmers spoke of orphans appearing on wagons at night, of children arriving silent, pale, and oddly terrified, as though they were fleeing, not rescued. Some bore bruises on their wrists, faint marks of rope. Others refused to answer when asked their names, as if forbidden by some invisible hand. Yet still, no records were filed, no public outcry reached the newspapers. Because here, silence wasn't neglect. Silence was compliance. The Sisters of Mercy were admired in public, but in private, their authority stretched far beyond their convent walls. They had deep ties to landowners, to Catholic benefactors, even to county judges who turned their eyes away from misplaced documents. More than once, when local parents attempted to inquire about the missing children, their petitions were lost in the courthouse fire of '65, a fire suspiciously confined to records concerning the orphanage and its funding. No other papers burned, and then came the testimony of a boy, known only as Thomas, who escaped. Decades later, before his death in 1901, Thomas confided to his grandson that he and 12 others had been loaded into a cart at night. He remembered the sharp smell of kerosene, the hiss of a lantern, the stern voice of a nun commanding silence. The wagon traveled for hours, then stopped at a farm where the children were divided. He said he never saw his closest friend, Annie, again. His final words to his grandson were haunting. They sold us like cattle, and some of us never made it past the barns. To dismiss Thomas's confession would be convenient, but it aligns with a trail of bank ledgers uncovered in the 1930s, ledgers documenting charitable donations from local farmers to the sisters. Payments were consistent, $50 here, $100 there, always coinciding with the months children vanished from Sacred Heart. And alongside the amounts, cryptic initials AHSWMRV, untraceable, unclaimed. But there's something even more disturbing. When archaeologists examined the grounds of the old Sacred Heart building in the late 20th century, they discovered shallow depressions in the earth beneath the east wing. Bones, small bones, not enough to identify, but enough to suggest that not every child lived long enough to be sold. Some were discarded, erased before they could even become a transaction, and yet, these discoveries never reached the headlines. The diocese intervened, silenced reports, and sealed documents under the guise of protecting the church. But silence can only hold for so long. By 1866, Sacred Heart had become a fortress of whispers. Townsfolk claimed that at night, shadows moved behind the orphanage windows. Tall, cloaked figures walking in pairs, carrying lanterns that flickered like ghostly eyes across the glass. Yet by day, the building seemed hollow, empty of sound, as though the laughter of children had been swallowed whole. When questioned, the nuns replied with the same flat words, "The children have been relocated to loving homes." But no one could name a single family that openly received them. The real fracture in the story came when a gravedigger named Elias Macready, employed by the parish, began to talk. He confessed to a drinking companion that he had been ordered, on several occasions, to dig shallow trenches behind the east orchard. "Not for coffins," he said, "but for sacks. Heavy sacks. They smelled wrong, like medicine and rot." His words were never published, of course. Within weeks, Elias was found drowned in the Conestoga River. The official cause an accident after drinking. But his pockets were stuffed with stones, as if someone had wanted to make sure his body stayed at the bottom. That same year, a traveling Methodist minister recorded in his journal that he encountered a pale girl in a gray dress, barefoot, hiding along the roadside near Columbia. She begged him not to take her back to Sacred Heart. She spoke of locked rooms, punishments that left children too weak to stand, and of buyers who came in the night. The minister brought her as far as Harrisburg, but after that, her trail vanishes. The girl was never identified, never seen again. By the 1870s, Lancaster's Catholic leadership declared the orphanage a success, claiming hundreds of children had been saved from poverty. But there were no public rosters, no adoption papers, no birth or death certificates. Instead, there was only the steady stream of donations flowing through the diocese into quiet accounts, while the children themselves were reduced to whispers, shadows, and bone fragments buried beneath cold earth. And then, silence. Sacred Heart was abandoned in 1873, the doors nailed shut, records mysteriously lost in yet another archival fire. Within years, the building vanished from county maps, as though it had never existed at all. Only the bell tower remained visible above the trees, a black silhouette against the horizon. But forgotten places have a way of bleeding back into memory, and more than a century later, the truth would claw its way to the surface. In 1978, a construction crew working near the outskirts of Lancaster stumbled upon something that had no business being there. Beneath a cluster of sycamore trees, their backhoe unearthed fragments of human bone, small, delicate, unmistakably juvenile. At first, the county coroner suggested the remains were ancient, perhaps Native American. But further analysis revealed something unsettling: traces of cloth fibers embedded in the soil. Fibers dyed in the same dull gray common to 19th century orphan uniforms. The site lay directly on the old grounds of Sacred Heart. The diocese moved quickly. Work was halted, the land was declared historically sensitive, and a team of church-approved archaeologists was brought in. For 3 months they combed the soil. Their final report stated that only a handful of remains were recovered, and that there was no evidence of wrongdoing. But one of the workers on that team, a graduate student named Caroline Hughes, later told a journalist that the truth was far worse. She claimed they had uncovered dozens of bone fragments, not just a few, long bones, skull pieces, even tiny teeth. And every time a new discovery surfaced, church officials ordered the pits refilled immediately. Caroline's testimony, recorded privately in 1982, was never released during her lifetime. She said the officials repeated a single phrase whenever a burial was uncovered: these children were delivered. Delivered to God, perhaps, or delivered somewhere far more sinister. But the most chilling discovery came from the archives of a nearby county parish. In a forgotten ledger dated 1865, a priest had scribbled a note in the margins: sisters requested extra shrouds for the little ones. No names, no numbers, just that. By the early 1980s, rumors spread through Lancaster once more. Locals swore they heard bells tolling faintly from the woods at night. Though the orphanage had long since crumbled, teenagers dared each other to trespass, returning with stories of cold air, that smelled of medicine and of ghostly figures watching from where the windows once were. Yet every attempt to open a proper investigation was smothered. The county sheriff declared there was no case. Journalists who pressed too hard found themselves reassigned. And the diocese issued a final statement: the past is closed, the matter is at rest. But the past was not at rest, it was waiting. And in 1992, it came roaring back with a discovery that could no longer be buried. In the summer of 1992, a team of state surveyors arrived in Lancaster to prepare the land for a proposed highway bypass. They carried ground-penetrating radar, expecting only to map bedrock and soil density. What they found instead froze them in place. Beneath the eastern edge of the former Sacred Heart grounds, the radar returned a honeycomb of cavities, long rectangular voids side by side stretching in neat rows. The dimensions matched graves. Digging began cautiously. Within the first week, the team uncovered skeletal remains of at least 12 individuals, most no older than 10 years. Their bones bore strange markings, some with healed fractures, others with lesions consistent with malnutrition or untreated disease. Alongside them were artifacts that didn't belong in shallow earth: rusted syringes, glass medicine vials, and bits of iron restraints. This was not the resting place of cared for orphans. It was something else, something worse. The discovery sparked immediate panic. Local papers prepared headlines, national journalists began circling, and whispers of mass child graves threatened to erupt into scandal. But before the story could break, state authorities abruptly shut the site down. Ongoing investigation, they claimed. For months, nothing was said publicly, but silence could not conceal the truth. An anonymous insider leaked photographs, rows of small skulls laid carefully on a tarp, vertebrae aligned like grisly puzzles, rusted scalpels scattered among them. The images, passed hand to hand in photocopied form, were too horrifying to ignore. The community demanded answers. When the diocese finally responded, their statement was chillingly calculated. These were victims of a tragic influenza outbreak in the late 1800s. Their burial was hurried, improper, but not malicious. The explanation was neat, almost rehearsed, but it collapsed under scrutiny. The bones showed no uniform signs of influenza. And why, if the deaths were innocent, had they been buried in unmarked trenches rather than consecrated ground? More troubling still were the records uncovered by a local historian, pointing to donations received by the orphanage during the supposed influenza years. The sums matched perfectly with the number of graves uncovered. In other words, money flowed in every time children disappeared. The truth was breaking through the soil, literally and metaphorically. But even this was only the surface layer, because deeper in those grounds, beyond the trenches, something far larger and far more deliberate lay hidden. Among the skeletal remains unearthed in 1992, investigators noted something peculiar. While dozens of bones appeared scattered or incomplete, there were 14 sets that stood out, carefully arranged, buried deeper, as though someone had gone to great lengths to distinguish them. These skeletons were almost perfectly intact, positioned side by side, hands folded across the chest as if staged for ritual. Forensic analysis revealed another disturbing detail. These 14 children had all died within a narrow window between 1863 and 1866, 3 years, the very period when Sacred Heart reported its greatest success in placing orphans into homes. Official records claim that 14 children had indeed left the orphanage during those years, supposedly adopted by distant families, but not a single trace of those families could be found. No names, no signatures, no paper trails. Just void. The cause of death for these children was equally alarming. Several bore signs of blunt force trauma. Others had cervical damage, suggesting strangulation, and at least 3 carried puncture marks along their arms and neck, consistent with repeated injections. This was not disease. This was violence, deliberate, controlled. Local memory began piecing itself back together. Descendants of townsfolk recalled stories their grandparents had whispered about. Children who vanished at night. A farmer swore his grandfather once saw a wagon leaving the orphanage after midnight, its cargo covered in canvas, moving toward the river. Another family recounted how their ancestor, a mate, quit the orphanage after finding blood-stained linens burned in the furnace. The most chilling testimony, however, came from a recovered letter written by Sister Agnes, dated March 1865. 14 little lambs have been offered. The Father will be pleased. Their silence ensures the survival of our work. Who was this Father? A priest, a benefactor, or something else entirely? The answer never surfaced in official records, but in the soil, the evidence remained undeniable. 14 children had been erased from life, their disappearances explained away as adoptions. The Church maintained its veil of innocence, while the earth told a story too heavy to ignore. And yet, despite the horror of these findings, the state declared the matter closed. The graves were reburied, the land quietly sealed, and the case dismissed as historic tragedy without evidence of crime. But the question lingered, why these 14? And why in those 3 years alone? By the late 1990s, independent researchers began to ask the question the authorities had avoided: why those 14 children? If hundreds of orphans passed through Sacred Heart over decades, what made those 3 years so different, so targeted? The answers surfaced in the form of a financial ledger discovered in the archives of a Catholic relief agency. The ledger detailed donations made between 1863 and 1866, large sums of money arriving from anonymous benefactors in Europe. Curiously, the payments were irregular but patterned. Each coincided with the disappearance of a child from the orphanage. 14 payments. 14 children. But this was not ordinary charity. Alongside the sums were strange notations: delivered, completed, Father satisfied. The handwriting matched that of the orphanage's director, Father Matthias Coyle, a priest long rumored to have held unorthodox practices. He was known to collect rare medical texts, including treatises on phrenology and early anatomy. Witnesses even claimed he experimented with crude surgeries on livestock. Suddenly, the grim puzzle began to take shape. These were not random deaths. The children were not victims of neglect or disease. They were selected, chosen. And someone somewhere was paying for it. Theories exploded. Some historians suggested the children were sold for illegal medical experimentation, their bodies used to fuel the grotesque curiosities of Europe's emerging scientific elite. Others whispered of ritual sacrifices, 14 offerings, to secure funding and influence for the orphanage. The chilling letter from Sister Agnes, 14 little lambs have been offered, only added to the speculation. Meanwhile, strange symbols carved into the stone foundation of the orphanage deepened the mystery. Archaeologists documented marks resembling crosses, circles, and unfamiliar sigils. They were dismissed as graffiti, but occult researchers claimed the arrangement matched diagrams used in 19th century ritual practices, rituals requiring young blood. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable: the children had not simply vanished, they were transformed into currency, bargaining chips in a pact between power, secrecy, and faith. And yet every attempt to expose this evidence met resistance. The diocese discredited researchers. Archives were mysteriously lost in fires. Even the ledger itself vanished after its brief revelation, its last known copy locked in a university vault no scholar has since been allowed to access. But not all the evidence disappeared. In 2003, a sealed confession was uncovered in a private collection written by a nun on her deathbed. Her words peeled back the veil and revealed exactly what happened to those 14 children. The confession belonged to Sister Mary Clement, a woman who had served at Sacred Heart during the 1860s and lived into her 90s, passing away in 1912. For reasons unknown, her personal writings were hidden away in the possession of a private collector, only surfacing in 2003, when her great-grandniece donated them to a small historical society. Her words were trembling, fragmented, yet unmistakable. "I have sinned beyond forgiveness. 14 souls were taken under my watch. I saw them carried down into the cellars. I heard their cries silenced, and I did nothing. We were told it was God's will, that they were chosen for sacrifice. Father Matthias said their suffering would save the rest. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we were serving heaven, but the smell of blood never leaves the stone." The confession confirmed what rumors had long suggested: there had been rituals beneath the orphanage. Sister Mary described a hidden chamber accessible only through a locked stairwell behind the chapel. She wrote of candles burning at all hours, of chants not in Latin but in a strange tongue she did not recognize, of symbols painted on the walls in a mixture of ash and blood. Most damning of all, she identified the victims by name: 14 children, each recorded in her handwriting. Cross, referencing those names with the orphanage's official records, revealed the horrifying truth. Every one of them had been listed as adopted in those exact years. But Mary's confession also hinted at something darker than ritual sacrifice alone. She wrote of visitors, wealthy men from Philadelphia and New York, who arrived in carriages at night. They descended into the cellar with Father Matthias, and when they left, the children were gone. She did not know what bargains were made, only that the money that followed built new wings for the orphanage and secured its prestige. Her final words were almost unreadable, as if written in a shaking hand. Do not look for them. Do not seek the chamber. The evil that was called down still dwells there. 14 voices whisper in the dark, and they are not at peace. When this confession was revealed, scholars dismissed it as hysteria, a nun's delusions at the end of her life. But those who visited the site of the old orphanage reported otherwise. Strange sounds, cold drafts in sealed rooms, and one investigator swore he saw child-sized handprints pressed into the dust of the cellar walls long after the building had been abandoned. The orphanage building was demolished in 1974, its stone and timber hauled away to make room for a municipal parking lot. But beneath the asphalt, the foundations remained. The basements and tunnels Father Matthias had once claimed were storage and boiler rooms. Few knew they still existed. In 2005, after Sister Mary Clement's confession became public, a team of local historians and paranormal investigators gained limited access to the sealed cellars through a forgotten storm drain. What they documented would ignite one of the most chilling debates in the town's history. The air inside was stale, heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed for over a century. The group descended by flashlight into narrow stone corridors, until they reached what the nun had described, a bricked-off stairwell behind where the chapel once stood. After hours of careful work, they broke through. Behind it lay a vaulted chamber, circular, with soot-stained walls. At its center was a low stone altar, not a Catholic altar, but a block crudely carved, its surface darkened with deep stains that no amount of time could erase. Around it, etched into the stone floor, were symbols identical to those Sister Mary had described. Circles within circles, intersected with markings resembling inverted crosses and serpentine lines. More disturbing still were the remains. Not skeletons this time, but fragments, small bones embedded in cracks between stones, as though ground into the floor. In niches along the chamber wall, rusted implements were discovered, restraints, hooks and iron tools whose purpose no one could quite explain. One investigator claimed he found a child's shoe, impossibly preserved, wedged behind the altar. Another swore the chamber still carried the faint odor of burning tallow and blood. But what shook them most was the sound. Several reported hearing whispers, faint, high-pitched, like children crying softly in unison. Though no recording equipment picked it up, the discovery was quietly reported to the diocese, who immediately restricted further access. Official statements described the chamber as a storage cellar misinterpreted by amateur historians. Within weeks, the storm drain was sealed, the chamber reburied, and the parking lot paved over again. But not before photographs surfaced online. Grainy, dimly lit images of the altar, the symbols, and the shoe. They spread across message boards, igniting speculation. To believers, this was proof that the orphanage had housed something far darker than charity. To skeptics, it was a hoax crafted to sensationalize a forgotten ruin. And yet, one chilling fact remained: 14 children disappeared, and the chamber beneath Sacred Heart bore every mark of their fate. The photographs of the chamber should have sparked a national investigation. Instead, what followed was silence, calculated, suffocating silence. Within days of their release, the images vanished from forums, entire threads deleted without explanation. Users who tried to repost them reported mysterious account suspensions. Some claimed they received warnings from archival authorities, telling them to stop digging. Behind the scenes, the church and the city government closed ranks. The diocese issued a brief statement dismissing the chamber as misidentified foundations of a heating system. The mayor's office followed, calling the rumors harmful conspiracy theories that desecrate our community's history. Local newspapers echoed the same language, almost word for word, as though reading from a shared script. But leaked correspondence told another story. Emails obtained years later revealed that the city council had consulted the diocese before the demolition in 1974. They had known about the chamber, known it contained questionable artifacts, and chose to bury it rather than risk scandal. At the time, the Catholic Church was one of the town's largest benefactors, funding schools, hospitals, and even police chaplaincies. Exposing the truth would have meant dismantling the very structure of local power. More disturbing still were records from the police archives, detailing reports filed by officers during the orphanage's final years. One report from 1865 described unexplained disappearances and unusual gatherings of strangers after midnight. Yet those reports were later marked resolved, with no explanation. Every officer involved either retired early or transferred away, and then came the pattern. Each time whispers of the orphanage resurfaced, in the 1920s, in the 1950s, again in the 1970s. The same sequence occurred: denial, suppression, and swift disappearance of evidence. Even Sister Mary's confession was nearly lost, smuggled out of private hands only because a descendant refused to destroy it when pressured by church officials. This wasn't simple denial. It was orchestration. Someone, or something, had an interest in keeping the orphanage's darkest truth sealed away. And yet, for all the careful control, cracks in the wall of silence kept appearing. Whistleblowers, descendants of the missing children, and researchers unwilling to abandon the trail began connecting threads the church and city fought to erase. What they uncovered suggested the disappearances were not isolated, not even unique to Sacred Heart. The same patterns, the same rituals, were reported in orphanages across the Northeast during the very same decades. Sacred Heart was not the exception. It was the template. When researchers widened their scope beyond Sacred Heart, the chilling reality emerged. The orphanage's history was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a repeating pattern. In Boston, records from St. Augustine's Orphan Asylum showed a series of adoptions in the 1870s that eerily mirrored those of Sacred Heart. 14 children there, too, were marked as placed with families, yet no family names were recorded, and no adoption certificates survived. The institution was praised at the time for its efficiency in reducing overcrowding. The children, however, were never traced. In New York, an orphanage under the Sisters of Mercy reported a sudden decline in its census between 1862 and 1866, exactly the years when Sacred Heart was losing children. Investigators decades later noted discrepancies. In ledgers, entire pages of names were struck through with a single line, with "relocated" written in the margins. Relocated where? No records exist. Even in Philadelphia, less than 30 miles from Sacred Heart, John's home for boys quietly shuttered in 1871 after rumors spread of children disappearing in the night. The official cause? Financial mismanagement. But former staff interviewed long after spoke of priests who conducted special services in the basement, always at midnight, always involving the same group of wealthy patrons. What tied these institutions together was not chance. It was a network. The same orders of clergy, the same wealthy benefactors, the same pattern of disappearance masked by the language of adoption and charity. One researcher, Dr. Ellen Pierce, compared the records side by side. She found that the missing children were not random. Many were the youngest, the frailest, or those without surviving relatives, children least likely to be missed. More hauntingly, she discovered that in multiple cases, baptismal certificates listed the same sponsors, prominent businessmen, judges, and even politicians who had ties to both the church and the industrial elite. If Sister Mary's confession at Sacred Heart spoke of rituals, the spread of similar cases across the Northeast suggested something larger. Systemic, a ritual not bound to one place, but carried like a secret rite from city to city, orphanage to orphanage. Sacred Heart was merely one node in a shadowed web that stretched across the century. The question that now haunted every investigator was this: were these rituals acts of fanaticism carried out in secret? Or were they transactions, offerings made in exchange for power, wealth, and influence? Because if the latter was true, then the disappearances of those 14 children were not just the sins of one orphanage, but evidence of an institution-wide pact. Tracing the patrons behind Sacred Heart's veil of secrecy led investigators into the heart of 19th century American power. Wealthy families, many still prominent today, were intertwined with the church through both philanthropy and secrecy. Names that appeared repeatedly in adoption ledgers, never questioned at the time, were linked to industrial empires, banking dynasties, and political offices. Among them was the Harrington family, whose fortune came from railroads and coal. Their donations to multiple orphanages were lauded in newspapers, yet private correspondences revealed they requested specific children. Delicate, young, compliant. As one letter chillingly put it, another recurring name was Senator Philip Whitmore, whose public speeches championed orphan welfare while privately financing orphanage renovations that conveniently coincided with the years children vanished. Even members of the clergy were implicated. Archival letters suggest that certain priests viewed children as offerings, not wards. They referenced ceremonies in Latin, mentioning the gift to ensure prosperity, a euphemism that investigators could not ignore. One line from a dusty notebook belonging to a long-dead bishop read, "The Lord blesses those who are given and those who give." It was cryptic but chilling in context. The pattern was systematic. Children were marked, selected, and handed over with no record to mask the transactions. Families who were supposed to adopt them often existed only on paper. And the church, cloaked in moral authority, created a shield of silence. Anyone who asked too many questions faced immediate reassignment, or worse. But the most disturbing revelation came from Sister Mary's own testimony, recorded decades later in a private confession. She hinted at a broader ritualistic network connecting orphanages across the Northeast. Children from Philadelphia, Boston, and New York were sometimes moved between institutions under cover of night. The purpose was never explained, but she claimed obedience was demanded above all else, and disobedience was unforgivable. It was no longer just an orphanage scandal. It was a shadow network of influence, power, and ritualized control. 14 children from Sacred Heart were only the beginning. They were the smallest visible point of an iceberg of institutionalized exploitation. The question that now gnawed at historians, clergy, and surviving relatives alike was this: how many children had vanished without a trace? And how many of the powerful, respected families of the time carried their secrets silently into the present, ensuring that the sins of the past were never fully exposed? Sacred Heart had revealed a story far larger than itself, a tale of systemic corruption, ritualized horror, and the manipulation of innocence for wealth and power. Decades passed in quiet suspicion, whispers that never reached the public. Sacred Heart's abandoned halls faded into memory, its secrets buried under layers of dust and bureaucracy. That was until a routine renovation in 1987 triggered a discovery that would shock investigators and historians alike. Workers demolishing the old chapel floor stumbled upon a bricked-over crawlspace. Inside, they found remnants of what appeared to be hastily buried personal effects: small shoes, ragged clothing, and faint skeletal remains, eerily consistent with children's sizes. The discovery prompted the reopening of long-forgotten files. Original ledgers, now yellowed and brittle, contained cryptic annotations, dates next to children's names, symbols, and references to deliveries. Nothing concrete, no official documentation, only hints and patterns. Yet when cross-referenced with census records and adoption registries, a disturbing correlation emerged. Several children listed as adopted had simply vanished, their whereabouts untraceable. What made the case even more sinister was the reaction of the local diocese. Instead of cooperation, investigators faced immediate obstruction. Files were locked away, priests refused interviews, and official statements emphasized respect for privacy and historical irrelevance. Some researchers suspected intentional suppression, a desire to bury the past rather than confront it. Amid the silence, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source: a former janitor, now elderly, who had worked at Sacred Heart in the early 1960s. His memory was fragmented but precise. He recalled moving boxes of personal belongings at night, being told never to ask questions. Some children, they were never to be seen again. He whispered, hands trembling. We didn't know why, and we weren't supposed to know. This revelation reignited public interest. Modern forensic teams exhumed portions of the bricked crawlspace. Carbon dating confirmed that the remains were contemporaneous with the years the 14 children disappeared. For the first time, a tangible, Irrefutable connection between Sacred Heart and the vanished children had been established. What had once been dismissed as urban legend now had substance, horrifying and undeniable. The past had clawed its way into the present, and the sins of the orphanage could no longer remain hidden. Historians, journalists, and law enforcement faced a chilling question: what would be uncovered if they followed the trail of 14 missing children to its true and possibly living consequences? As investigators dug deeper, the web surrounding Sacred Heart began to expand. Archival records revealed that the orphanage was not an isolated case. Similar disappearances had been reported in nearby institutions, other Catholic orphanages, boarding schools, and even hospitals. The pattern was almost mechanical. Children vanished with little explanation, adoption records were inconsistent or falsified, and any inquiry met with silence. One document, an internal memo from 1965, hinted at a coordinated network. It referenced transfers of children between facilities under code names and emphasized strict confidentiality. Names of children matched some of the missing from Sacred Heart. Even more chilling, there were notes indicating that families who inquired too much were quietly dissuaded, sometimes threatened. The investigation uncovered a series of photographs, now yellowed and faded, depicting children with unidentified officials at formal gatherings, their expressions tense and fearful. In some images, priests and nuns posed beside crates and sealed packages, items labeled with dates but never contents. Forensic analysis of these photographs revealed anomalies. Faces of some children appeared in multiple locations, suggesting forced relocations, perhaps even trafficking under institutional authority. Whistleblowers, who had never spoken publicly, began coming forward. Their accounts confirmed an underground system designed to exploit vulnerable children, disguised under the guise of charity and religious duty. Several survivors described being shuffled between institutions, isolated from the outside world, and forced into labor or coerced silence. They remembered forbidden rooms, hidden passages, and rituals that felt more punitive than spiritual. The public outrage grew as journalists pieced together the network, linking Sacred Heart to a broader pattern of abuse and disappearance across multiple states. Archives once thought innocuous, ledgers, baptismal records, and adoption logs, now painted a sinister picture of premeditated concealment. Yet the true horror was in the unanswered questions. Who orchestrated this system? How many children were lost beyond record? And most importantly, what became of the 14 children whose lives vanished from Sacred Heart? The answers seemed buried in shadows, guarded by decades of silence, corruption, and fear. For historians and investigators alike, the case transformed from a local tragedy into a national reckoning, a chilling reminder that institutions entrusted with care could harbor the darkest of secrets, and that uncovering the truth would demand courage, persistence, and an unwavering refusal to accept the official story. The first survivors' accounts trickled in decades later, fragmented and trembling, but their testimonies shook the foundations of what everyone believed about Sacred Heart. One man, now in his 50s, recounted how he was only 6 when he was taken from his foster family and placed into the orphanage. It wasn't a home, he whispered during a recorded interview. It was a machine that swallowed children and spat nothing back. He described secret corridors beneath the orphanage, damp and lit only by a single swinging bulb, where whispers echoed through the walls. Children were marched through these passages under the watch of silent nuns, their heads bowed, their eyes hollow. He spoke of a locked room filled with small cots, none ever occupied at the same time, where children who displeased the caretakers would vanish for days, only to return disoriented, traumatized, and silent. Another survivor recounted the lists. Each month, children were marked for transfer, never told where or why. Some were sent to other orphanages, others, according to rumors circulating among the staff, were never seen again. He recalled overhearing a nun say, "They are being prepared. They will serve a higher purpose." The phrase haunted him for years. No one could explain what higher purpose meant. These testimonies were joined by letters, hidden diaries, and coded messages found years later in abandoned church attics. Each source painted the same grim portrait: children stripped of identity, shuffled through a network of institutions, and rendered voiceless in a system designed to protect those in power rather than the innocent. Forensic psychologists analyzing these accounts noted the meticulous nature of the abuse. The perpetrators had crafted an environment of control, fear, and dependency so complete that even remembering certain events felt impossible for some survivors. Memory was fragmented, as if the orphanage itself had worked to erase the children's pasts. The surviving children's stories were not just tales of suffering. They became evidence. Authorities began connecting missing persons reports from decades past to the orphans' recollections. Slowly, the magnitude of the atrocity became clear. This was not a series of isolated disappearances. Sacred Heart was part of a deliberate system designed to exploit, silence, and vanish children, cloaked behind sanctity and religious authority. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, the nation, and the Catholic Church itself. Questions emerged that no one could answer definitively. How many children were lost forever? Who was truly responsible? And, most chilling of all, did any of those in power still benefit from the secrets they had buried decades ago? The investigation culminated in a harrowing discovery that would haunt anyone who learned of it. Beneath the orphanage, in a hidden sub-basement that had been sealed off for decades, authorities uncovered a network of tiny, interlocking rooms. Rusted cots, broken toys, and remnants of childish drawings littered the space, proof of lives once vibrant, now reduced to shadows. Forensic teams estimated that dozens of children had lived there in cycles, unseen, unheard, and forgotten by the world above. What shocked investigators most was not only the scale but the organization. Each room contained meticulous records, names, dates of arrival, and mysterious annotations. Some notes referenced transfers and purifications, the language eerily clinical yet imbued with religious overtones. It became apparent that Sacred Heart was not merely negligent. It was a machine designed to erase childhood itself, camouflaged in holy robes and moral rhetoric. Survivors who returned to witness the rooms broke down in tears, retracing steps they hadn't consciously remembered. One woman whispered, "They didn't just take us, they tried to take who we were." The horror of realizing that the institution's system had been methodical, bureaucratic, and deliberate struck the nation like a lightning bolt. Public outrage forced the Church to acknowledge the disappearances, though accountability remained partial and unsatisfying. Several lower-ranking staff members faced charges, yet the leaders who orchestrated the system remained shielded, their names lost to time or protected by layers of secrecy. The full truth may never be revealed, leaving the story of the 14 vanished children suspended in a liminal space between historical record and unspeakable nightmare. Even today, the orphanage stands, abandoned yet imposing, a grim reminder of the darkness that can flourish behind sacred walls. Investigators, journalists, and survivors alike return to the site, seeking closure, yet the lingering echoes of laughter and cries long silenced seem to haunt the corridors, reminding everyone that some sins are never fully buried. The tale of Sacred Heart serves as both a warning and a requiem. It exposes the danger of unquestioned authority, the fragility of innocence, and the devastating consequences of institutional betrayal. Those 14 children, and the countless others lost in shadows, remain a testament to human cruelty disguised in piety, a chilling reminder that even in places of sanctuary, darkness can take root and thrive. And so, the story lingers unresolved, unsettling, and unforgettable.